There are places in this country that don't make it onto any map. Places where people go and the version of themselves that comes back is never quite the same. Tonight, 4 people are going to sit across from you and tell you exactly what happened to them. Not what they think happened, not what they wish had happened, what actually happened. By the time this video ends, you will not look at the wilderness the same way again. You will not look at the dark the same way again. And some of you already know what I'm talking about, because you felt it too. That feeling that something out there already knows your name. Stay until the end. The last account is the one that will stay with you longest. If this is your first time here, you are watching Midnight Grin. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every time we return, we bring something darker. Let's begin. I was 11 when Kay handed me the porcelain doll, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled like dead leaves. The party was winding down, cake crumbs scattered across our kitchen table, and most of my friends had already gone home. But Kay lingered, clutching this final present with an odd intensity that made my stomach flutter with unease. "My aunt gave this to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep it. It watches me when I try to sleep." The doll was beautiful in the way only expensive things can be. Pristine white dress with intricate lace trim, real human hair styled in perfect ringlets, and those glass eyes that seemed to hold depth beyond their painted surfaces. When I lifted it from the wrapping, its weight surprised me. This wasn't some cheap plastic toy. This was crafted with care, meant to last generations. My grandmother inspected it with the practiced eye of someone who knew quality when she saw it. "This is genuine porcelain," she told me, running her weathered fingers along the doll's painted cheeks. "These cost hundreds of dollars. They're not meant for playing. They're collectibles, meant to be displayed and admired." That first night, I placed the doll on my dresser, angling it so it faced my bed. The moonlight streaming through my bedroom window caught its glassy stare, creating an almost ethereal glow around its features. I remember lying there, studying every detail, the tiny painted lips, the delicate eyebrows, the way its dress fell in perfect folds around its porcelain limbs. Something felt different about my room that night. The familiar creaks and settling sounds of our old house seemed amplified, more pronounced. Every shadow appeared deeper, every corner darker. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Victorian parlors and children who never aged, their laughter echoing through empty hallways lined with identical dolls. 3 years later, we moved to the old log cabin, nestled in the woods about 20 miles from town. The place had character, hand-hewn beams, a stone fireplace that dominated the living room, and windows that let in filtered sunlight through ancient oak trees. My doll had traveled with me through every move, carefully wrapped and protected in a special box my grandmother had bought specifically for it. By then, I had acquired the second doll, smaller, with auburn hair and a blue velvet dress, as an Easter gift from my parents. Where the larger doll exuded an elegant sophistication, this one possessed an almost childlike mischief in its painted expression. Together, they made quite a pair on my bedroom dresser. The cabin's atmosphere affected everyone differently. My parents loved the rustic charm and the peace of being surrounded by nature. I found it comforting, like living inside a storybook. But when my sisters came to live with us that fall, their reactions to both the house and my dolls were immediate and visceral. The first time my youngest sister entered my room, she stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the dolls with wide, frightened eyes. "Why are they looking at me like that?" she asked, backing toward the door. "Their eyes, they're following me." I laughed it off, explaining that it was just an optical illusion created by the way glass eyes were painted. But even as I dismissed her fears, I noticed something I hadn't before. When I moved from one side of the room to the other, the doll's gazes did seem to track my movement. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it, but undeniably there. My middle sister's reaction was even stronger. She refused to sleep in our shared bedroom until I agreed to turn the larger doll around to face the wall. "I can feel it watching me," she insisted, her voice shaking. "Even when I close my eyes, I can feel those glass eyes boring into me." To keep peace, I began rotating the doll each night, though I found their concerns somewhat amusing. After all, I'd lived with these dolls for years without incident. They were beautiful objects, crafted with skill and artistry. What could possibly be frightening about them? As autumn deepened into winter, my sister's discomfort with the dolls only intensified. They began making specific requests about how the doll should be positioned, with increasingly detailed instructions about angles and sight lines. The larger doll wore a small velvet hat with a delicate brim, part of its original outfit, and my sisters discovered that pulling this hat down over the doll's eyes seemed to provide them with psychological relief. Please, my youngest sister would plead every night before bed. Just pull the hat down so it can't see us while we sleep. I obliged, finding their ritual both endearing and slightly ridiculous. Each evening I would carefully adjust the tiny hat, pulling it forward until the doll's glass eyes were completely obscured. It became part of our bedtime routine, as regular as brushing teeth or saying prayers. But then strange things began happening. I would wake in the morning to find the hat mysteriously pushed back, the doll's eyes once again visible and seemingly alert. At first I assumed I hadn't pulled it down far enough, or perhaps the hat had simply shifted during the night due to vibrations from people walking around the house. The third time it happened, I made sure to pull the hat down securely, even tucking the edges carefully around the doll's forehead. The next morning, not only was the hat pushed back, but it was positioned higher than it had ever been before, as if someone had deliberately lifted it to give the doll the best possible view of our bedroom. My sisters noticed immediately. They demanded I move the dolls out of our room entirely, but I refused. These were my possessions, gifts that meant something to me, and I wasn't going to banish them to some dusty closet because of what I still believed were irrational fears. Instead, I began paying closer attention. I started checking the hat's position multiple times throughout the night, getting up at various hours to ensure it remained pulled down. What I discovered made my skin prickle with unease. Without fail, sometime between midnight and dawn, that hat would be repositioned, always in the exact same way, pushed back just enough to fully expose the doll's eyes, angled slightly as if the doll were trying to get a better view of something specific. The summer I turned 16, I traveled to Florida to spend 2 months with my aunts. It was my first extended time away from home, and while I was excited about the beaches and warm weather, I felt oddly reluctant to leave my dolls behind. They had become such a constant presence in my life that their absence felt like leaving part of myself behind. Before departing, I carefully positioned both dolls according to my sister's specifications, facing my bed with the larger one's hat pulled down securely. I even placed them slightly further back on the dresser, thinking that might help my sisters feel more comfortable during my absence. The Florida summer passed in a blur of sun, sand, and family gatherings. My aunts kept me busy with beach trips, shopping excursions, and visits to local attractions. For weeks, I barely thought about the dolls or what might be happening back home. It wasn't until I received a frantic phone call from my youngest sister that the familiar chill of unease crept back into my thoughts. "You need to come home," she whispered into the phone, her voice tight with fear. "Something's wrong with your doll. It's moving around by itself." She described waking up one morning to find the larger doll sitting on the edge of my bed, hat pushed back, appearing to survey the room with those unblinking glass eyes. Both sisters swore they had placed it back on the dresser the night before, face down, hat secured. Yet there it sat, positioned as if it had been watching them sleep. The incidents escalated throughout the summer. My middle sister reported finding the doll in different locations each morning, sometimes on the windowsill, once sitting in my desk chair facing their beds, another time discovered standing upright near the bedroom door as if it had been trying to leave the room. The most disturbing incident occurred just a week before my return. Both sisters had grown so unnerved by the doll's apparent movements that they decided to contain it more securely. They wrapped it in a blanket and placed it inside my closet, shutting the door firmly and even positioning a chair against it for good measure. The next morning they found the closet door standing open, the chair moved aside, and the doll sitting on my bed, unwrapped and positioned exactly as they had first found it, hat back, eyes exposed, facing their beds with an expression that seemed almost triumphant. When I returned from Florida, tan and relaxed, I found both sisters pale and jumpy, reluctant to spend time in our bedroom during daylight hours, and absolutely refusing to sleep there after dark. They had moved into the living room, creating makeshift beds on the couch and floor, claiming they felt safer in the open space near our parents' room. 2 years later, after we had moved into our new house on the other side of town, I left for college. The new house was modern, bright, and cheerful, everything the old cabin hadn't been. I had hoped this change of environment might put an end to the strange occurrences surrounding my dolls, but distance seemed only to amplify their mysterious behavior. I had arranged my dolls on a wooden bookshelf near my bedroom door, positioned where they could overlook the entire room. The shelf also held several wooden boxes containing my jewelry and other small treasures, creating a small display area that pleased me greatly. It was during my second semester that my grandmother began reporting the sounds. She described them as rhythmic knocking, like someone rapping their knuckles against wood with deliberate measured beats. The sounds always came from my room, always during the early morning hours when the house was otherwise completely quiet. "It's probably your mini fridge," she reasoned when she first mentioned it to me over the phone. "Those old units can make all sorts of strange noises when the compressor kicks in." But when I asked her to describe the sound more specifically, her explanation didn't match anything a refrigerator might produce. These weren't the mechanical hums, clicks, or rattles typical of appliances. These were deliberate, purposeful sounds, three sharp raps, followed by a pause, then three more raps, repeating in an endless cycle that sometimes lasted for hours. The pattern never varied. Rap, 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 silence. Rap, 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 silence. It was too regular to be random, too purposeful to be mechanical. My grandmother timed the intervals and discovered they occurred exactly every 30 seconds, with precision that would have been impossible for any natural settling or expansion of the house's materials. On the third morning of these disturbances, my grandmother decided to investigate. She crept down the hallway toward my room, following the sound to its source. As she approached my door, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. She could pinpoint its origin to the exact area where I kept my dolls and wooden boxes. But the moment she turned the doorknob, the sound ceased completely. She entered the room, examined the mini fridge, checked all the wooden surfaces for signs of shifting or movement, but found nothing out of place. The dolls sat exactly where I had left them, their glass eyes reflecting the morning sunlight streaming through my windows. Yet as soon as she returned to her bedroom and closed the door, the knocking resumed with the same methodical persistence. This happened every time she approached my room over the next several weeks. The sounds would continue right up until the moment she touched my doorknob, then stop so abruptly it left her ears ringing in the sudden silence. When I returned home for spring break, my grandmother insisted I investigate the mysterious sounds myself. I spent one entire afternoon examining every inch of my room, checking for loose boards, examining the mini fridge's internal mechanisms, even testing the stability of the wooden bookshelf. Everything appeared normal, yet my grandmother's accounts were so detailed and consistent that I couldn't dismiss them as imagination. It was during this visit that my parents' friend Heather learned about the dolls and their alleged supernatural activities. Heather had always been fascinated by ghost stories and claimed to have had several paranormal experiences of her own. When she heard about the moving hat, the changing positions, and the mysterious knocking, she begged me to let her see the dolls for herself. I was reluctant to allow anyone into my room without supervision. These were precious possessions, after all, and I didn't appreciate people handling them without permission. But Heather was persistent, and my parents encouraged me to let her satisfy her curiosity. What I didn't know was that Heather had no intention of simply observing the dolls. While I was outside helping my father with yard work, she snuck into my room with her phone camera, determined to capture evidence of supernatural activity. She later described her experience in vivid, unsettling detail. The room had felt oppressive the moment she entered, as if the air itself had grown thick and resistant. The dolls sat on their shelf, the larger one positioned slightly forward, hat pulled back, eyes seeming to track her movement as she approached. Heather lifted her phone and focused on the larger doll's face, zooming in to capture the intricate details of its painted features. Through the phone's screen, she watched the doll's reflection, waiting for any sign of movement or anomaly. What happened next made her drop the phone and flee the room in terror. As she watched through the camera's display, the doll's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, suddenly shifted to look directly at her. Not the subtle optical illusion that glass eyes sometimes create, but a definite, deliberate movement from one fixed point to another. She managed to take the photo at the exact moment the eyes moved, capturing what she swore was undeniable proof of supernatural activity. When she showed me the image later, I had to admit there was something unsettling about it. The doll's expression seemed more alert, more aware than I had ever noticed before. Its eyes appeared to have depth and intelligence that transcended mere painted glass. But what disturbed me most was realizing that someone had been in my room without permission, handling my possessions and violating my privacy. From that day forward, I made sure my bedroom door was always locked when I wasn't home, and I moved the dolls to a position where they faced the door itself, as if they were now serving as guardians of my personal space. As I entered my senior year of college, the incidents involving my dolls became more frequent and more difficult to rationalize away. During one particularly stressful finals week, I was studying late in my room when I heard a soft thudding sound behind me. I turned to see the smaller doll lying face down on the floor, having apparently fallen from its shelf position. I picked it up, examining it carefully for any damage. The porcelain was uncracked, the clothing intact, but as I held it in my hands, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The doll felt warm, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight, despite the fact that my room was lit only by a desk lamp and the shelf received no direct heat from any source. More disturbing still was the way the doll's hair had become disheveled, as if someone had been running their fingers through it. The strands were tangled and wild, completely different from the neat styled appearance it had maintained for years. When I tried to smooth the hair back into place, several strands came loose in my hands, far more than normal wear should have caused. As I worked to restore the doll's appearance, I found myself studying its face more intently than I had in years. There was something different about its expression, something I couldn't quite identify. The painted features were identical to what I remembered, yet somehow the overall effect had changed. Where once the doll had appeared sweetly innocent, it now seemed to possess a knowing, almost calculating look. The temperature in my room began to fluctuate wildly during this period. I would wake up shivering despite having gone to sleep in comfortable warmth, or find myself sweating in what should have been cool conditions. My roommates never experienced similar temperature changes in their rooms, and maintenance could find nothing wrong with our heating and cooling systems. Most unsettling of all were the dreams that began occurring with increasing frequency. I would dream of being in vast, dimly lit rooms filled with hundreds of identical dolls, all arranged on shelves that stretched up beyond the reach of any light. In these dreams, I was always searching for something, though I never knew what, while the dolls watched my frantic movements with silent, patient attention. The dreams felt different from normal nighttime imaginings. They possessed a clarity and consistency that made them seem almost like memories rather than fantasy. I would wake with the distinct impression that I had actually been somewhere else, that some part of me had spent the night wandering through those endless galleries of watching eyes. Now, at 22, I continue to live with my dolls despite everything that has happened over the years. They sit in my current apartment, positioned on a shelf near my desk where I can see them as I work. The larger one still wears its velvet hat, though I no longer bother pulling it down to cover its eyes. After more than a decade together, we seem to have reached an understanding of sorts. I have learned to recognize the signs of their activity, the subtle temperature changes, the way shadows seem to shift and dance around their shelf, the occasional sounds of movement when no one else is home. Rather than frightening me, these phenomena have become part of the rhythm of my daily life, like living with peculiar but ultimately harmless roommates. Just last week, as I was writing late into the night, I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. When I turned to look, I could have sworn I saw the smaller doll's position had shifted slightly, its body angled more toward my desk as if it had been trying to see what I was working on. Instead of alarm, I felt an odd sense of companionship, as if my audience of two had simply been showing interest in my activities. My friends and family still react with varying degrees of unease when they see the dolls. Some refuse to stay in my apartment overnight, claiming the dolls make them uncomfortable. Others are fascinated and ask endless questions about the strange incidents I've experienced. A few have suggested I get rid of them entirely, arguing that no possessions are worth the stress and fear they seem to generate. But I can't imagine parting with them now. They've become an integral part of my identity, witnesses to my growth from childhood through young adulthood. Whatever intelligence or awareness they might possess, I believe it means me no harm. We've coexisted for too many years through too many changes and challenges for our relationship to be purely malevolent. Sometimes during quiet evening hours I find myself talking to them, not because I expect responses, but because their constant presence has made them confidants of a sort. I tell them about my day, my worries, my plans for the future. Their glass eyes reflect my words back to me with what I choose to interpret as understanding rather than judgment. There are moments when I catch myself wondering what they might say if they could speak, what stories they might tell about the years we've spent together. But then I remember the old warning my grandmother mentioned long ago, that you should never break a china doll, lest the spirit inside take its revenge. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved. Perhaps some companions are meant to remain beautiful, silent, and slightly unsettling. As long as they continue to watch over me with those enigmatic glass eyes, offering their own form of protection and presence, I think I can live with not knowing exactly what lies behind their painted smiles. After all, everyone needs someone to keep them company in the darkness, even if that someone happens to be made of porcelain and dressed in lace. 2 years ago, in the sweltering heat of July 2023, my acquaintance Sam extended an invitation that would forever change my perspective on what lurks in the shadows of seemingly innocent places. We'd only known each other through mutual friends at college, sharing perhaps a dozen conversations over the course of a semester. So when he called asking if I wanted to join him and his family for a week at their cabin in Lake Tahoe, I was both surprised and hesitant. "It's this old place my grandfather built back in the 60s, Sam explained over the phone, his voice crackling through a poor connection. 4 stories if you count the basement and loft. There's even a smaller guest cabin out back. My parents think it would be good for me to bring some friends this year." The hesitation in my voice must have been apparent because he quickly added, "You can bring someone if you want. There's plenty of room." That's when I thought of David. My best friend since middle school, the one person who shared my love for horror movies and ghost stories, though we'd never experienced anything genuinely frightening ourselves. David was the type who would analyze every creaking floorboard and explain away every shadow with scientific reasoning. His presence would make the trip bearable, even enjoyable. The 3-hour drive from our college town to Lake Tahoe should have been relaxing. David navigated while I drove, the windows down, music playing softly as we wound through increasingly mountainous terrain. But as we climbed higher, something felt wrong. The air grew thick and oppressive, despite the altitude. The trees seemed to lean inward over the road, creating a tunnel of shadow that the afternoon sun couldn't quite penetrate. "You notice how quiet it is?" David said, turning down the radio. "No birds, no insects, just nothing." I had noticed. The usual sounds of summer in the mountains were completely absent. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. I pressed the accelerator, suddenly eager to reach our destination and escape the suffocating silence of the forest. Sam's directions led us down a winding dirt road that seemed to snake deeper into the woods with each turn. The trees grew taller and more densely packed, their branches intertwining overhead until we were driving through what felt like a natural tunnel. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I had to roll up the windows and turn on the heat. "There," David said, pointing ahead. "I can see a clearing." The relief I felt was immediate and profound. The oppressive feeling that had been building in my chest began to ease as we emerged from the tree line into a large, sunlit clearing. But that relief was short-lived. The cabin that loomed before us was not what I had expected. Sam had described it as old, but I hadn't anticipated the air of neglect and decay that seemed to permeate the structure. The main building was indeed 4 stories, but it appeared to sag under its own weight, as if the years had slowly been crushing it into the earth. The wood siding was weathered to a sickly gray, and several shutters hung at odd angles from their hinges. A long flight of wooden stairs led up to the main entrance, each step sagging slightly in the middle from decades of use. The railings were loose, wobbling dangerously when touched. As we climbed, I noticed that many of the balusters were missing entirely, leaving gaps that seemed to stare down at us like empty eye sockets. "Home sweet home," Sam called out from the front door, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't match the nervous energy radiating from his posture. "Come on up." The layout Sam had described over the phone became clear as we explored. The front door opened into a cramped foyer with a door to the basement on the left and stairs curving up to the right. The basement door was painted a deep red that looked almost black in the dim light, and something about it made me want to avoid looking directly at it. Following Sam up the curving staircase, I noticed the walls were covered in old family photographs, but they were so faded and water-stained that the faces were barely recognizable. The few that were clear enough to make out showed people from decades past, their expressions stern and unwelcoming. The second floor housed a bedroom to the left and what Sam called the utility area to the right, a cramped space containing the hot tub, laundry facilities, and water heater. The hot tub was covered with a tarp that had clearly been there for years, and the water heater made concerning gurgling sounds that echoed through the pipes in the walls. Another flight of stairs led to the third floor, which opened into a large living room. The space might have been welcoming once, but now it felt cavernous and cold. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, creating ghostly silhouettes in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. The kitchen was tucked into the left corner, its avocado green appliances clearly dating from the 1970s. "And that's the loft," Sam said, pointing to a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness above. "That's where you guys will be sleeping. Hope you don't mind the close quarters." The loft was a low-ceilinged space under the eaves, with just enough room for a few mattresses on the floor. The single window was covered with heavy curtains, and when I pulled them aside, I was greeted by a view of the smaller cabin Sam had mentioned. It sat about 50 yards away, connected to the main building by a well-worn path through the trees. The guest cabin was a 2-story structure that somehow looked even more neglected than the main house. Its windows were dark, and something about the way it sat among the trees made it seem like it was watching us. "We'll probably spend most of our time over there," Sam said, noticing my gaze. "It's got a great view from the second-floor balcony." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Every time I looked toward the tree line, I expected to see someone standing there watching. But there was never anyone there, just the deepening shadows and the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with a mist that clung to the ground and made the air feel thick and heavy. Sam's parents had prepared breakfast in the main cabin's kitchen, but the atmosphere was strained. His mother kept glancing nervously toward the windows, and his father seemed unusually quiet, barely speaking except to grunt responses to direct questions. "Why don't you boys go check out the guest cabin?" Sam's mother suggested, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Get some fresh air before the day gets too hot." Something in her tone suggested this was less a suggestion and more a desperate attempt to get us out of the main cabin. I caught David's eye, and he nodded slightly. He'd noticed it too. The walk to the guest cabin felt longer than it should have, the mist seeming to muffle our footsteps and make the surrounding trees appear and disappear like phantoms. The cabin's exterior was even more deteriorated up close. The paint was peeling in long strips, and several of the boards were warped and split. The front door was painted the same unsettling dark red as the basement door in the main cabin. Sam produced a set of keys from his pocket, their metal surface black with age and wear. "My grandfather always kept this place locked," he said, struggling with the key in the stubborn lock. "Said it was too valuable to leave open, though I never understood what was so valuable about it." The lock finally gave way with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through the mist. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that made my teeth ache. The interior was dark and smelled of old wood, mildew, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. The first floor was a single room with a stone fireplace on one wall and a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. The floorboards were warped and stained, and they groaned ominously under our weight. But it was the walls that truly unsettled me. They were covered in old photographs, but unlike the faded family portraits in the main cabin, these were sharp and clear. They showed the cabin and surrounding area from decades past, but in every single photograph there were figures in the background, shadowy forms that seemed to be watching from the tree line. "Weird, right?" Sam said, noticing my attention. "My grandfather was really into photography. He documented everything that happened around here." I moved closer to examine one of the photographs. It showed the clearing where the main cabin now stood, but the cabin itself was much smaller, perhaps only 2 stories. In the background, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees, was a figure that appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing. But what made my breath catch was the figure's face, or rather, the complete absence of features where a face should have been. "Sam," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who are these people in the photographs?" He moved to stand beside me, squinting at the image. I don't know. I never really looked at them closely before. My grandfather never talked about them." David had moved to the window on the left side of the room and was struggling with the latch. "This window's been painted shut," he said, putting his shoulder against the frame. "Probably hasn't been opened in years." With a sudden crack, the window flew open and a rush of cold air filled the room. The mist outside swirled and eddied, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing watching us. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. "Let's check out the second floor," Sam suggested, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. The staircase was narrow and steep, with railings that felt loose and unreliable. Each step creaked and sagged, and I found myself gripping the railing despite my distrust of its stability. The second floor was even smaller than the first, containing only a small sitting area and a door that led to what Sam had described as a balcony. The balcony was really more of a small deck with a railing that felt dangerously low. It offered a view of the main cabin and the surrounding forest, but from this elevated position, the trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching toward the cabin like grasping fingers. We stood on the balcony for about 15 minutes, trying to make casual conversation. But the oppressive atmosphere made normal chatter feel forced and unnatural. The mist continued to swirl around us, and the silence of the forest was so complete, it was almost deafening. "I think I'm ready to head back," David said finally, and I could hear the relief in his voice. As we turned to go back inside, I pulled the balcony door closed behind us. The latch clicked with a finality that seemed to echo through the small space. What happened next would replay in my mind for months afterward, each detail becoming more vivid and disturbing with each recollection. We had descended to the first floor and were preparing to leave when David suddenly stopped and stared at the window he had struggled to open earlier. "That's impossible," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The window that had been painted shut, the one that had required significant effort to open, was now closed again. Not just closed, it looked exactly as it had when we'd first entered the cabin, as if it had never been opened at all. "Maybe it just fell shut," Sam suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. David moved to the window and examined the frame carefully. "Look at this," he said, running his finger along the edge. "The paint seal is intact. This window hasn't been opened in years." The three of us stood staring at the window, trying to process what we were seeing. There had to be a logical explanation. Windows didn't just seal themselves with paint, but the evidence was undeniable. The window appeared exactly as it had when we'd first entered the cabin. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. We headed for the door, but as we reached it, Sam stopped and patted his pockets frantically. "The keys," he said. "I left them on the balcony." The thought of going back up those stairs, of returning to that oppressive second floor, made my skin crawl. But without the keys, we'd have to explain to Sam's parents how we'd gotten locked out of the cabin they'd trusted us to explore. "I'll get them," I said, though every instinct screamed against it. I climbed the stairs again, each step feeling heavier than the last. The second floor felt different now, smaller, more claustrophobic. The air seemed thicker, and I had to fight the urge to hold my breath. I found the keys on the small table next to the balcony door and grabbed them quickly, eager to escape. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The balcony door was standing wide open. I had closed it. I was absolutely certain I had closed it. The memory of the latch clicking into place was crystal clear in my mind. But now it stood open, and the mist from outside was drifting into the room, carrying with it the smell of decay and something else, something that reminded me of old photographs and forgotten spaces. I backed toward the stairs, not taking my eyes off the open door. As I reached the top step, I heard it, a sound that would haunt me for months afterward. It was a soft shuffling, like footsteps, coming from the balcony. I didn't wait to see what might be making the sound. I ran down the stairs, taking them two at a time, and burst into the first floor where David and Sam were waiting. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing David's arm and pulling him toward the door. "What happened?" Sam asked, but I was already pushing past him, fumbling with the door handle. "I'll tell you outside," I said, finally getting the door open. We stepped out into the mist, and I turned to close the door behind us. But as I did, I looked back into the cabin one last time. At the top of the stairs, just visible in the dim light, was a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. It was tall and thin, and it seemed to be watching us leave. I slammed the door shut and turned the key in the lock, my hand shaking so badly I could barely manage it. The click of the lock seemed to echo through the mist, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from inside the cabin, came the sound of footsteps moving across the floor above. The three of us stood frozen in the mist, staring at the locked door of the guest cabin. The footsteps continued for several long moments, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to move from one end of the second floor to the other. Then, abruptly, they stopped. "Did you guys hear that?" Sam whispered, his face pale. David nodded slowly. "Someone's in there." The logical part of my mind tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps a board had fallen, or an animal had somehow gotten inside. But the sounds had been too rhythmic, too purposeful. They were definitely footsteps, and they were definitely human. "We need to go back to the main cabin and tell your parents," I said, my voice barely steady. "No," Sam said quickly. "They'll think we're just being kids, making up stories. They already think I'm too imaginative." "Then what do you suggest?" David asked. Sam looked back at the cabin, his jaw set with determination. "We go back in. We find out who's in there." The idea of returning to that oppressive space made my stomach churn, but I couldn't let Sam and David go alone. We decided to return to the main cabin first, to arm ourselves with whatever we could find. Sam's parents were nowhere to be seen, but we found a collection of kitchen knives and some heavy flashlights in a utility drawer. "If there's someone in there," David said, testing the weight of a large carving knife, "they're trespassing. We have every right to confront them." The walk back to the guest cabin felt like a march to execution. The mist had grown thicker, reducing visibility to just a few feet in any direction. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Every shadow looked like a potential threat, every sound like an approaching footstep. We reached the cabin door, and Sam hesitated with the key in his hand. "What if they're dangerous?" he asked. "What if they're not there at all?" David countered. "What if we just imagined it?" I knew we hadn't imagined it, but I didn't voice that thought. Instead, I gripped my flashlight tighter and nodded for Sam to unlock the door. The cabin interior was exactly as we'd left it, but the atmosphere felt different, charged with tension and the lingering sense of a presence that didn't belong. We stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. The silence was complete, but somehow threatening. "Hello?" Sam called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "If anyone's in here, you need to come out. This is private property." No response. The only sound was our own breathing and the distant drip of water from somewhere in the walls. "Let's check the first floor thoroughly," David suggested. We moved through the single room methodically, checking behind the sparse furniture and in the corners where shadows gathered. The stone fireplace was cold and empty, filled only with ancient ashes. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch us as we searched, their shadowy figures more ominous in the dim light. "There's nowhere to hide down here," Sam said. "If someone was in the cabin, they had to be upstairs." The prospect of climbing those stairs again made my skin crawl, but there was no alternative. We had to know for certain whether someone had been in the cabin or if we were losing our minds. I led the way up the narrow staircase, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. Each step creaked and groaned, announcing our presence to anyone who might be waiting above. The second floor came into view gradually, first the ceiling, then the walls, then the floor. It was empty, completely, utterly empty. We searched every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. The small sitting area contained only a few pieces of old furniture, none large enough to conceal a person. The balcony door was closed now, though I was certain I had left it open. "There's no one here," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then who was walking around up here?" Sam asked. I was examining the floor, looking for any sign that someone had been present. The floorboards were covered in a fine layer of dust, and our footprints from our earlier visit were clearly visible. But there were other marks too, long, dragging impressions that suggested something heavy had been moved across the floor. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the marks. We followed the trail of disturbed dust from the top of the stairs to the balcony door. The marks were too regular to be accidental, too purposeful to be anything but deliberate. Someone or something had indeed been moving around up there. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight with fear. As we turned to leave, I took one last look around the room. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was something that made my breath catch. It was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, lying on the floor near the wall. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was a photograph similar to the ones that covered the walls downstairs, but this one was different. It showed the guest cabin from the outside, taken from the position where we had been standing just minutes earlier. In the second-floor window, clearly visible despite the old quality of the photograph, was a figure. The figure was tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed to be from decades past. But it was the face that made me drop the photograph and stumble backward. Where the face should have been, there was nothing, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "What is it?" Sam asked, but I was already running for the stairs, the photograph forgotten on the floor behind me. We fled the cabin, locking the door behind us with hands that shook so badly we could barely manage the key. The mist seemed to part before us as we ran, as if eager to help us escape. We didn't stop running until we reached the main cabin, where we collapsed on the front steps, gasping for breath. "What did you see?" David asked, his face pale and drawn. I tried to explain about the photograph, about the figure in the window, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. The image was burned into my mind, that smooth, featureless face staring out from the second-floor window. "We can't tell anyone about this," Sam said. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, though I wondered if we were crazy. The alternative, that something genuinely inexplicable was happening in that cabin, was almost too frightening to consider. Despite our mutual agreement to keep our experience secret, the events at the guest cabin dominated our thoughts for the rest of the day. We went through the motions of normal vacation activities, eating meals, making small talk with Sam's parents, pretending to enjoy ourselves, but the oppressive atmosphere of the place seemed to have infected all of us. Sam's parents noticed our subdued mood but attributed it to the gloomy weather and the isolation of the cabin. "You boys seem quiet today," his mother observed during lunch. "Maybe you should go into town this afternoon, get some fresh air." The suggestion was tempting, but something kept us from leaving. It was as if the cabin had claimed us, as if we were compelled to stay and witness whatever was unfolding. David, ever the rational one, suggested we approach the situation scientifically. "If there's really something unusual happening," he said as we sat in the main cabin's living room, "then we should be able to document it, get evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Sam asked. "Photographs, recordings, detailed observations. If we're going to convince anyone else, or even ourselves, that something's going on, we need proof." I wasn't sure I wanted proof. The memory of that featureless face in the photograph was already more than I could handle. But David's logical approach was reassuring, and it gave us something to focus on other than our growing fear. We spent the afternoon gathering supplies, cameras, notebooks, a portable tape recorder Sam found in his father's belongings. As evening approached, we made our plans. "We'll go back to the guest cabin after dark," David said. "If there's really something there, it might be more active at night." The idea of returning to that place in the darkness made my stomach clench, but I agreed. We had to know for certain what we were dealing with. Dinner was a strained affair. Sam's parents seemed increasingly uncomfortable, glancing frequently toward the windows, as if expecting to see something unwelcome. His father kept clearing his throat and starting to speak, then stopping himself. Finally, as we were finishing our meal, he set down his fork and looked directly at us. "Boys," he said, his voice serious, I want you to stay away from the guest cabin after dark." The three of us exchanged glances. "Why?" Sam asked. His father was quiet for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "There have been incidents over the years. Nothing dangerous exactly, but unsettling. Your grandfather had some strange ideas about that place." "What kind of incidents?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Sounds, mostly. Footsteps, voices, that sort of thing. Probably just the old wood settling, but it's better to be safe." He paused, then added, "Your grandfather used to say the cabin was occupied, but he was always a bit eccentric." Sam's mother shot her husband a sharp look. "Don't fill their heads with nonsense," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's not nonsense if it keeps them safe," he replied. The conversation ended there, but the damage was done. Whatever we had experienced at the guest cabin, it was part of a larger pattern that stretched back years, perhaps decades. The knowledge should have been reassuring. We weren't losing our minds, and we weren't the first to experience the phenomena. Instead, it was terrifying. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, we made our final preparations. We decided to approach the investigation in shifts, one person watching from the main cabin with binoculars, while the other two explored the guest cabin with cameras and recording equipment. "I'll take the first watch," David volunteered. "You two check out the cabin, and I'll document anything I see from out here." The plan was logical and methodical, exactly what David excelled at. But as we prepared to leave the safety of the main cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. The night was moonless and overcast, with a thick fog that had rolled in from the lake. Our flashlights created small pools of light in the darkness, but beyond their reach, the world disappeared into an impenetrable black void. The guest cabin loomed ahead of us, its windows dark and empty. "Are you sure about this?" Sam asked as we approached the door. I wasn't sure about anything, but I nodded anyway. We had come too far to turn back now. The key turned in the lock with the same grinding sound as before, and the door swung open to reveal the interior of the cabin. Our flashlight beams swept across the room, illuminating the photographs on the walls. In the dancing light, the shadowy figures in the images seemed to move and shift, their featureless faces turning to follow our movements. "Let's get this over with," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We began our investigation systematically, photographing everything, making detailed notes, recording our observations. The tape recorder's mechanical whir was oddly comforting in the oppressive silence. But as we worked, I became increasingly aware of a presence watching us from the shadows. It started as a feeling, a sense of being observed. But gradually, it became more concrete. There were sounds, soft, shuffling noises, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of fabric against wood. They were so quiet they could have been imagined, but they were persistent and seemed to come from the second floor. "Do you hear that?" Sam whispered. I nodded, my grip tightening on the camera. The sounds continued for several minutes, growing gradually louder and more distinct. They were definitely footsteps, pacing back and forth across the floor above our heads. "We need to go up there," I said, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else. The staircase seemed longer than before, each step an eternity of creaking wood and rising fear. The second floor was dark and empty, but the temperature was noticeably colder than the floor below. Our breath misted in the frigid air, and the floorboards were covered with a thin layer of frost. "That's not normal," Sam said, his voice barely audible. I began taking photographs, the camera flash illuminating the room in stark white bursts. In the brief moments of brightness, I thought I could see shapes moving in the corners, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there. The tape recorder was picking up sounds we couldn't hear, whispers and shuffles, and what sounded like distant conversation. When we played it back, the voices were too indistinct to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably human. We spent nearly an hour in that freezing room, documenting everything we could, but it was the photographs that provided the most disturbing evidence. When we developed them later, several showed anomalies. dark shapes that shouldn't have been there, faces in the windows that none of us remembered seeing. One photograph in particular made my hand shake as I held it. It showed the balcony door, standing slightly ajar. In the gap between the door and the frame, partially obscured by shadow, was a figure. It was tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed to be from decades past. And where its face should have been, there was nothing but smooth, featureless darkness. The next day brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the cabin. If anything, the evidence we had gathered the night before made everything worse. The photographs and recordings provided proof that something was indeed happening at the guest cabin. But that proof came with a terrible price. The knowledge that we were not alone in this isolated place. Sam's parents seemed to sense our distress, though they attributed it to the gloomy weather and the isolation. "Why don't you boys find something fun to do?" his mother suggested after a particularly quiet breakfast. "No point in moping around all day." It was Sam who came up with the idea for the game. "Hide and seek," he said, "but with a twist. We'll use sheets and pretend to be ghosts. The person who's it has to find the ghosts without getting caught." The game was clearly an attempt to inject some normalcy into our increasingly surreal situation, to reclaim some sense of control over our environment. David and I agreed readily, eager for any distraction from the events of the previous night. We spent the afternoon preparing, gathering sheets from the linen closet, and deciding on the rules. The game would take place in the main cabin, with the second-floor bedroom as the base where the seeker would start. The ghosts would hide throughout the building, moving from location to location to avoid capture. "It'll be fun," Sam said, but his forced cheerfulness didn't hide the nervousness in his voice. As evening approached, we began our game. I volunteered to be the first ghost, partly because I wanted to move around the cabin, and partly because I didn't want to be alone in the bedroom, waiting for the others to find me. I draped a sheet over my head and began looking for a hiding place. The main cabin was full of nooks and crannies, shadows and alcoves where a person could conceal themselves. I eventually settled on a spot near the kitchen where I could observe the living room while remaining hidden. The game proceeded normally for the first few rounds. We took turns being the seeker, the ghosts, switching roles every few minutes. It was almost fun, in a childish way, and for brief moments I could forget about the guest cabin and its mysterious occupant. But as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, the game took on a more sinister tone. The sheet-covered figures became genuinely frightening in the dim light, their movements silent and purposeful. More than once, I found myself genuinely startled by one of the ghosts emerging from the shadows. It was during my second turn as a ghost that I saw it. I was hiding in the basement stairwell, peering out through a gap in the sheet, when movement outside caught my eye. Through the small basement window, I could see the guest cabin across the clearing. Its windows were dark, as they had been all day. But as I watched, a figure moved past one of the second-floor windows. The figure was tall and thin, moving with a gliding motion that seemed to defy gravity. It passed from one side of the window to the other, clearly visible despite the darkness inside the cabin. But what made my blood freeze was the realization that the figure was at least 12 feet above the ground, far too high for anyone to reach without a ladder. I threw off the sheet and ran up the stairs, bursting into the living room where Sam and David were still playing their game. "I saw it," I gasped, pointing toward the guest cabin. "In the window, there's someone in there." The game ended abruptly as all three of us crowded around the living room window, staring across the clearing at the guest cabin. The windows were dark and empty now, showing no sign of the figure I had seen. "Are you sure?" David asked, his voice tight with tension. "I'm sure," I said, though I was beginning to doubt my own sanity. It was in the second-floor window, moving from left to right. "But that's impossible," Sam said. "The cabin's been locked all day, and that window is too high for anyone to reach from outside." We stared at the cabin for several more minutes, but nothing moved in its dark windows. The fog was beginning to roll in again, obscuring the details of the building and making it seem to fade in and out of existence. "Maybe it was just a reflection," David suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "A reflection of what?" I asked. There's nothing around here that could create a reflection like that. We abandoned the game and spent the rest of the evening watching the guest cabin from the main cabin's windows. The fog grew thicker as the night progressed, and the guest cabin became increasingly difficult to see. But every now and then I thought I could make out movement in its windows, shapes that seemed to glide back and forth across the glass. "We need to go over there," Sam said finally. "We need to find out what's happening." "No," I said immediately. "Absolutely not. Not at night." David agreed with me, but Sam was insistent. "If there's really someone in there, we need to know. And if there isn't—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. We argued for nearly an hour, but eventually, exhaustion won out. We agreed to postpone any investigation until the next day, when we could approach the cabin in daylight. But as we prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the image of that figure gliding past the window, its movements too smooth and purposeful to be human. The loft where we slept was cold and cramped, but it offered a view of the guest cabin through its single window. I pulled aside the heavy curtains and peered out into the fog-shrouded night. The guest cabin was barely visible, just a dark shape against the darker forest. But as I watched, lights began to appear in its windows. Not electric lights, but something softer and more diffuse like candlelight or oil lamps. The lights moved from room to room, creating a pattern that suggested someone was walking through the cabin with a lamp or candle. I wanted to wake David and Sam, to show them what I was seeing, but I was paralyzed by fear. The lights continued to move through the cabin for nearly an hour, sometimes appearing in the first-floor window, sometimes in the second-floor window, sometimes visible on the balcony. Finally, as exhaustion overcame fear, I fell asleep with my face pressed against the cold glass of the window. My last conscious thought was of the figure in the guest cabin, pacing back and forth with its ethereal light, waiting for something. I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m., the digital clock on the nightstand glowing red in the darkness. Something had pulled me from sleep. A sound, a movement, a presence that didn't belong. The loft was silent except for David's steady breathing beside me, but I could feel that something was wrong. I sat up carefully, trying not to wake David, and looked toward the window. The fog had lifted slightly, and the guest cabin was more visible than it had been earlier. But what I saw made every muscle in my body go rigid with terror. There was a figure moving up the stairs to the loft. Not in the guest cabin, but here, in the main cabin, climbing the stairs toward where we slept. It was tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed to be from decades past, and it moved with that same gliding motion I had seen in the guest cabin window. I tried to wake David, but my voice wouldn't work. I could only watch in frozen horror as the figure reached the top of the stairs and began moving toward our sleeping area. It made no sound as it walked, its feet seeming to barely touch the floor. As it drew closer, I could see its face, or rather, the absence of a face. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The sight of that blank face was so terrifying that I felt my mind trying to shut down, to retreat into unconsciousness rather than process what I was seeing. But somehow, I managed to reach out and shake David's shoulder. He woke instantly, his eyes wide and alert. One look at my face told him everything he needed to know, and he turned to look toward the stairs. The figure had stopped moving. It stood at the foot of our sleeping area, its featureless face turned toward us. For a long moment we stared at each other across the dark loft. Then, without warning, the figure turned and began walking back toward the stairs. David was already reaching for his camera, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I whispered. "Just don't." We watched as the figure descended the stairs, its movements silent and purposeful. When it reached the bottom, it paused and seemed to look back at us. Then it continued toward the front door of the cabin. "It's leaving," David whispered. But I knew it wasn't leaving. It was going back to where it belonged, back to the guest cabin where it had been waiting for decades. The realization that we had somehow disturbed its rest, that our presence had awakened something that should have remained undisturbed, was almost too much to bear. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We lay in our sleeping bags, staring at the ceiling and jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, we were exhausted and shaken, but relieved to see daylight streaming through the windows. Sam woke to find us already packed and ready to leave. "What's wrong?" he asked, but one look at our faces told him everything he needed to know. "We have to go," I said. "Today, now." He didn't argue. Within an hour, we had loaded our belongings into the car and were ready to leave. Sam's parents seemed relieved to see us go, though they tried to hide it behind polite protestations about our early departure. "You boys are welcome back any time," Sam's father said, but his tone suggested he hoped we wouldn't take him up on the offer. As we drove away from the cabin, I turned for one last look at the guest cabin. In the second-floor window, barely visible in the morning light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, wearing clothes from decades past, and it seemed to be watching us leave. I didn't tell David or Sam what I had seen. There was no point. We were leaving, and that was all that mattered. The drive back to college was silent for the first hour. Finally, David spoke. "What do you think it was?" "I don't know," I said, and I meant it. "I don't think I want to know." "Do you think we'll ever go back?" I thought about the figure in the window, the featureless face, the lights moving through the cabin in the night. "No," I said. "I don't think we will." Sam invited me to return to the cabin the following summer, but I declined. I had no desire to revisit that place, to risk another encounter with whatever inhabited the guest cabin. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning when the world is quiet and still, I find myself thinking about that figure. I wonder if it's still there, pacing through the rooms of the guest cabin, waiting for the next group of visitors to disturb its rest. And I wonder if, somewhere in the darkness, it's thinking about us too. The memory of that blank, featureless face haunts me still, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The knowledge that there are things in this world that exist beyond our understanding, things that watch us from the shadows and wait for us in the darkness. I never returned to the cabin, and I never spoke of our experience to anyone outside of David and Sam. But the memory remains, as vivid and terrifying as ever. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can almost hear the sound of footsteps moving across the floor above, patient and purposeful, waiting for the right moment to descend the stairs. The Tahoe cabin taught me that some places are meant to be left alone, that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, and that sometimes the most frightening thing of all is not what we see in the darkness, but what we know is there, watching us from the shadows, waiting for its moment to reveal itself. God help anyone who stays there long enough to find out what that moment might be. I was 17 when this happened, and even now, 3 years later, the memory still makes my hands shake when I hold a rifle. My family lived in a remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies, about 40 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls. Dad had been taking me hunting since I was 12, teaching me to track, to shoot, to respect the wilderness that surrounded our home. Those trips were sacred to us, just father and son, away from the distractions of civilization, connecting with something primal and pure. It was October 15th, 2021, when we planned what would become our last hunting trip together. The aspens were turning golden, painting the mountainsides in brilliant yellows and oranges. Dad had been planning this particular expedition for months, targeting a remote area called Devil's Canyon, about 15 miles northeast of our cabin. He'd heard reports of a massive elk herd moving through the area, and the promise of bagging a trophy bull had him more excited than I'd seen him in years. "This is going to be the trip, son," he told me as we loaded our gear into his old Ford pickup. "I can feel it in my bones." Dad was 45 then, a weathered man with calloused hands and eyes that could spot movement in the forest from a quarter mile away. He worked as a logger during the week, but hunting was his true passion. He knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods, could navigate by landmarks and instinct, even when the trails disappeared. The drive to Devil's Canyon took us along increasingly narrow dirt roads, each turn taking us deeper into wilderness that felt untouched by human presence. The last road was barely more than 2 tire tracks through the undergrowth, branches scraping against the truck's windows as we bounced over rocks and fallen logs. As we drove, Dad told me stories about the area, how it got its name from the treacherous ravines that could swallow a man whole, how Native American tribes used to avoid it during certain seasons, claiming the spirits there were restless. I'd always dismissed these tales as local folklore, the kind of stories that grew around any isolated place. But as we descended into the canyon, with its towering pine trees blocking out most of the afternoon sun, I began to understand why people might feel uneasy here. The forest seemed different from our usual hunting grounds, quieter. The normal sounds of wildlife, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were muted, as if the very air was thick enough to absorb sound. Even our truck engine seemed to run quieter, the rumble of the diesel motor becoming a whisper. When we finally reached our planned camping spot, a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the temperature was dropping fast. Dad parked the truck at the edge of the clearing, and we both climbed out, stretching muscles stiff from the bumpy ride. "Look at this place," Dad said, breathing deeply. "Nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction." He was right. Standing there in that clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens and jagged peaks, I felt the weight of isolation settle over us like a heavy blanket. Our cell phones had lost signal hours ago, and the nearest ranger station was at least 20 miles away on foot. If something went wrong out here, we were truly on our own. But that isolation was also part of the appeal. In a world increasingly connected and crowded, these wild places offered something rare: genuine solitude, the chance to test yourself against nature without safety nets or backup plans. Dad had taught me to see this not as a threat, but as a gift. As we began unloading our gear, I noticed something that made me pause. The clearing showed signs of previous use: a circle of blackened stones marking an old fire pit, some fallen logs arranged as makeshift benches. But what struck me as odd was how old these signs looked. The fire pit was filled with ash and debris that seemed like it hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe decades. Moss grew over parts of the stone ring, and the logs were rotting and covered in mushrooms. "When was the last time anyone camped here?" I asked Dad. He looked around, frowning slightly. "Hard to say. Could be years. That's what makes this spot so perfect. We've got it all to ourselves." But something about the abandoned campsite bothered me. If this was such a perfect hunting location, why hadn't anyone used it recently? The area should have been popular with hunters, especially during elk season, yet everything suggested the clearing had been untouched for a very long time. I pushed the thought aside and focused on setting up camp. We had a lot of work to do before dark, and the temperature was already dropping. Our breath was beginning to show in small white puffs, and I knew the night would be cold, probably below freezing. We worked efficiently, our movements coordinated by years of camping together. Dad set up our 2-man tent while I gathered firewood and cleared the old fire pit. The familiarity of these tasks was comforting, a reminder that we knew what we were doing out here. We'd camped in conditions far worse than this, had weathered blizzards and thunderstorms in these mountains. As darkness began to creep through the trees, we got our fire going. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding forest, creating an island of warmth and light in the growing darkness. We cooked a simple dinner of canned stew and instant coffee, the hot food warming us from the inside out. Sitting by the fire, listening to the crack and pop of burning wood, I began to feel more at ease. This was what hunting trips were supposed to feel like: peaceful, primal, connected to something larger than ourselves. Dad seemed relaxed too, leaning back against one of the old logs and staring up at the stars that were beginning to appear between the pine branches. "Tomorrow's going to be a good day," he said quietly. I can feel it. I nodded, sharing his optimism. We'd planned to start hunting at first light, working our way up the ridge on the far side of the canyon where Dad expected to find elk sign. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds. Perfect hunting conditions. But as I settled into my sleeping bag that night, listening to the sounds of the forest around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond our campfire's reach. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me tense, straining my ears for sounds that didn't belong. I told myself it was just normal hunting nerves, the hyper-awareness that came with being in wild country where predators roamed. Bears, mountain lions, wolves, they were all out there somewhere in the darkness. But this felt different somehow, more personal, as if whatever was watching had intelligence behind its gaze. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the crackling of our dying fire and Dad's steady breathing beside me. I woke before sunrise, as was my habit on hunting mornings. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and our breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Through the tent walls, I could see the faint gray light of dawn beginning to filter through the forest canopy. Dad was already stirring, and within minutes we were both up, moving with the quiet efficiency of experienced hunters. The morning routine was sacred to us, building up the fire, making coffee, eating a quick breakfast of oatmeal and dried fruit. We spoke in whispers, partly out of habit, and partly because the pre-dawn forest seemed to demand silence. Every sound we made, the scrape of a spoon against a metal cup, the rustle of gear being organized, seemed unnaturally loud in the still air. As the sky gradually lightened, the forest around us began to reveal itself in greater detail. In daylight, our campsite looked different, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. The ring of trees that had felt protective in the darkness now seemed to press in on us, their trunks like dark pillars supporting a roof of interwoven branches that blocked out most of the sky. Dad checked his watch, a battered military timepiece that had belonged to his father. "Sun will be up in 20 minutes, he whispered. "We should head out soon." We finished our coffee in silence, then began the process of preparing for the hunt. Rifles were cleaned and loaded, ammunition checked and counted. We dressed in layers, thermal underwear, wool shirts, insulated jackets, waterproof outer shells. Our boots were treated leather, broken in over years of use, with aggressive treads for gripping on steep terrain. Dad spread out his topographical map on a flat rock, weighing down the corners with stones. The paper was laminated and marked with pencil notations from previous hunts, a record of successful spots and promising areas. He pointed to a ridgeline about 2 miles northeast of our camp. "We'll work our way up this drainage," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "Should intersect with game trails right about here. If we don't find fresh sign by noon, we'll circle back and try the south face." I studied the map, memorizing landmarks and escape routes. Dad had taught me to always know where I was in relation to camp, to never venture into country without understanding how to get back out. The topography here was complex, steep ridges separated by narrow valleys with numerous side canyons that could confuse even experienced outdoorsmen. As we shouldered our packs and checked our gear one final time, I noticed something that made me pause. Along the tree line at the edge of our clearing, about 50 yards from our tent, I could see what looked like deep scratches in the bark of several large pines. The marks were too high to have been made by any animal I was familiar with, at least 8 feet off the ground, and they appeared fresh, the exposed wood still pale and unscarred by weather. "Dad," I said quietly, pointing toward the trees, "look at those marks." He followed my gaze, squinting in the dim light. After a moment, he shrugged. "Probably bears marking territory. Big grizzly can reach pretty high when he wants to." But something about the scratches bothered me. They were too regular, too deliberate, and they formed a pattern. 3 parallel gouges, about 6 inches apart, repeated on tree after tree along the perimeter of our clearing. It looked less like territorial marking and more like... I couldn't put my finger on what it reminded me of. "Should we be worried?" I asked. Dad considered this, then shook his head. Bears avoid humans if they can. Making noise, keeping a clean camp, that's usually enough. Besides, he patted the .45 pistol on his hip. We've got protection if we need it. We set off into the forest just as the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the canopy, creating shafts of golden light that illuminated particles of dust and pollen floating in the air. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles and fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps, and the air was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. The trail we followed was barely visible, little more than a game path worn by deer and elk over countless seasons. It wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, occasionally opening into small meadows where we could see patches of sky. Dad moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in these mountains, reading the subtle signs that marked our route. Broken branches, disturbed earth, the way certain trees leaned in response to prevailing winds. We'd been walking for about an hour when we encountered the first sign that something was wrong. In a muddy section of trail beside a small stream, we found tracks. Boot prints in the soft earth, but unlike any I'd ever seen. They were huge, at least size 15, but shaped wrong somehow. The heel was too narrow, the toe area too wide, and there was something odd about the stride length that made my skin crawl. Dad knelt beside the tracks, studying them intently. "Hunter, maybe," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Big guy." "When do you think these were made?" I asked. "Hard to say. Could be yesterday, could be last week. Ground's been soft since the rain." But as we continued up the trail, we found more tracks, and they all told the same disturbing story. Someone, or something, had been moving through this area recently, and whoever it was had been following the same route we were now taking. The tracks appeared at regular intervals, always in the muddiest spots where they would show clearly, as if they'd been deliberately placed for us to find. The pattern of the stride bothered me more than anything else. It was too long for a normal human gait, suggesting either someone extraordinarily tall or something that moved in a fundamentally different way than people did. And there was something about the depth of the impressions that suggested enormous weight, far more than even a large man should carry. We reached the ridge line around mid-morning, emerging from the dense forest onto a rocky outcropping that provided a commanding view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking, miles of unbroken wilderness stretching to the horizon, with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. But the beauty of the scene was overshadowed by what we found at the edge of the overlook. Someone had been here before us, and recently. The evidence was unmistakable. A small fire pit built from loose stones, still containing cold ashes. Nearby, we found the remains of what might have been a meal. Bones scattered around the fire, picked clean and cracked open. But these weren't the remains of normal camp food. The bones were too large, too thick, and they'd been broken in ways that suggested incredible strength. "What do you think killed this?" I asked, holding up what looked like a femur from a large animal. Dad examined the bone, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Could be a bear kill, or maybe wolves." But we both knew that wasn't right. The bones showed no tooth marks, no signs of being gnawed by scavengers. Instead, they looked like they'd been deliberately broken, the marrow extracted with surgical precision. And the sheer number of bones suggested an animal much larger than anything that lived in these mountains. Elk, maybe, but bigger than any elk I'd ever seen. We spent several minutes examining the site, trying to piece together what had happened here. The fire had burned hot enough to crack some of the stones in the ring. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing, had taken time to construct it properly. But why build a fire on this exposed ridge, where it could be seen for miles? As we prepared to leave the overlook and continue our hunt, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Carved into a nearby aspen tree about 7 feet off the ground was a symbol I'd never seen before, a complex pattern of intersecting lines that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at it directly. The carving was fresh, the bark around it still weeping sap, and it had been cut deep into the wood with something incredibly sharp. "Dad," I called softly, "you need to see this." He joined me at the tree, staring up at the symbol with growing alarm. Neither of us could identify what it meant, but there was something inherently disturbing about its design, something that made us both want to look away. "We should head back," Dad said quietly. "Something's not right here." For the first time since we'd arrived in Devil's Canyon, I heard uncertainty in his voice. Dad was not a man easily shaken. He'd faced charging bears, survived blizzards, navigated treacherous terrain in conditions that would have killed less experienced outdoorsmen. But something about this place, about the accumulating evidence that we weren't alone, had gotten under his skin. As we made our way back down the ridge, retracing our steps toward camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every sound made me jump and spin around, rifle ready. The forest that had seemed so peaceful at dawn now felt hostile, alien, as if we'd stumbled into territory where humans weren't welcome. The descent should have taken us an hour, but we made it in 45 minutes, our pace quickened by growing unease. When our campsite came into view through the trees, we both felt a surge of relief. The familiar sight of our tent, the cold fire pit, the truck parked at the edge of the clearing. These things represented safety, civilization, a connection to the world we understood. But as we approached the camp, Dad suddenly stopped, holding up his hand for silence. Something was wrong. I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. Our campsite had been visited while we were gone. The evidence of intrusion was subtle but unmistakable to eyes trained in wilderness awareness. Our tent, which we'd left securely zipped and properly staked, now showed signs of examination. The rainfly was slightly askew, pulled away from the tent body in a way that suggested someone had lifted it to peer underneath. More disturbing, the zipper pulls hung at different positions than we'd left them, small details that might escape a casual observer. But Dad and I had developed habits of precision over years of camping in country, where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. "Stay alert," Dad whispered, unshoulder his rifle and working the bolt to chamber around. Could still be around. We approached our campsite with the caution of soldiers entering hostile territory, moving from tree to tree, using cover, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Our truck appeared untouched, still parked where we'd left it, keys hidden in the magnetic box under the rear bumper. But our gear told a different story. The camp chairs we'd positioned around the fire pit had been moved. Not dramatically, but enough to create a different arrangement than the neat semicircle we'd established the night before. One chair was turned completely around, facing away from the fire toward the darkness of the surrounding forest, as if someone had sat there watching the tree line for hours. Our food supplies, stored in a locked metal bear box, remained secure, but the box itself had been moved several feet from its original position. Given that the container weighed nearly 50 pounds when loaded, this suggested either multiple people or someone of extraordinary strength. More disturbing, we found clear handprints in the dirt around the box, prints that matched the strange tracks we'd discovered on the trail. "What the hell is going on here?" I muttered, kneeling beside the bear box to examine the prints more closely. The handprints were human in basic structure but wrong in proportion. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and the thumb seemed to extend at an unnatural angle. Most unsettling, the prints pressed deep into the hard-packed earth, suggesting hands that had gripped with incredible force. Dad was conducting his own examination of the campsite, moving in careful circles, reading the ground like a book. His face grew increasingly grim as he discovered more evidence of nocturnal visitors. Boot prints circled our tent multiple times, suggesting someone had walked around our shelter repeatedly while we slept. The thought made my skin crawl. We'd been unconscious and vulnerable while unknown intruders moved freely through our camp. "How many?" I asked. "Hard to say. Maybe one person, maybe more. Whoever it was knew how to move quietly. Most of these prints are in soft spots where they'd show clearly, but I'm not finding much sign in the harder ground." This observation was particularly disturbing. It suggested our visitors weren't simply curious campers or lost hikers, but individuals skilled in wilderness craft, people who understood how to move through the forest without leaving unnecessary evidence. The selective placement of clear prints almost seemed deliberate, as if they wanted us to know they'd been here. We spent the next hour systematically searching the area around our camp, expanding our search in concentric circles. What we found painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The mysterious visitors had been thorough in their reconnaissance, examining every aspect of our presence in the canyon. They'd approached our truck, leaving faint scratches on the paint where they'd tested the door handles. They'd investigated our fire pit, stirring through the cold ashes with what appeared to be a stick or branch. Most alarming, we found evidence that they'd watched us from concealment. About 70 yards from our camp, hidden in a dense thicket of pine saplings, we discovered a crude blind, branches arranged to create a viewing position with clear sight lines to our tent and fire pit. The ground showed signs of prolonged occupation, with compressed vegetation and several cigarette butts scattered around the position. The cigarette butts were a revelation, proof that we were dealing with human intruders rather than animals, but they raised as many questions as they answered. The brand was unfamiliar, hand-rolled rather than manufactured, and they had an odd smell when Dad examined them. Not tobacco, but something earthier, more organic. Local Indians, maybe? I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it sounded weak. Dad shook his head. Native tribes around here don't use this area for hunting, haven't for generations. Besides, this doesn't feel like traditional activity. He was right. There was something fundamentally wrong about the evidence we were uncovering, something that suggested purposes we couldn't understand. The methodical examination of our camp, the deliberate placement of clear tracks, the hidden observation post. It all suggested planning and intelligence, but directed toward goals that remained opaque. As we continued our search, the forest around us seemed to grow more oppressive. Clouds had moved in while we'd been investigating, blocking out the sun and casting everything in gray shadow. The temperature was dropping and a wind had picked up, causing the trees to creak and sway in ways that created constant movement in our peripheral vision. We found the final piece of evidence about 100 yards north of our camp, in a small clearing beside the stream where we'd collected water the night before. Someone had constructed what could only be described as a shrine, a careful arrangement of animal bones, stones, and organic materials that formed a complex pattern on the ground. At the center of the arrangement sat a human skull, bleached white and obviously old, its empty sockets seeming to stare directly toward our campsite. The skull was the most disturbing element, not just because of what it represented, but because of its condition. It showed no signs of trauma, no bullet holes or impact damage that might suggest an accidental death. Instead, it appeared to have been carefully cleaned and preserved, treated with something that had given the bone an almost translucent quality. "We need to leave," Dad said quietly, staring at the grotesque arrangement. "Right now." I couldn't have agreed more. Whatever was happening in Devil's Canyon, we'd stumbled into something far beyond our understanding or ability to handle. The shrine represented a level of deliberate malevolence that made my hands shake as I shouldered my rifle. We returned to camp and began breaking down our gear with urgent efficiency. There was no discussion of continuing our hunt, no debate about whether we were overreacting. The accumulated evidence had crossed a line from merely unsettling to genuinely threatening, and both of us recognized that our safety depended on immediate departure. As we worked to pack our equipment, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, expecting to see figures watching us from the shadows. The sensation of being observed had grown stronger throughout the morning, becoming an almost physical pressure that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "How long do you think they've been watching us?" I asked as we collapsed the tent. "Could be since we arrived," Dad replied grimly. "Maybe longer. That fire pit at the overlook. What if they knew we were coming? What if they've been tracking us since we left home?" The thought was terrifying, suggesting a level of premeditation that transformed our situation from an unfortunate encounter with local weirdos into something far more sinister. If we'd been targeted specifically, if our movements had been monitored and predicted, then we might be walking into a trap by leaving the relative security of our campsite. But staying was clearly not an option. Whatever the risks of departure, They paled in comparison to the certainty that remaining in Devil's Canyon would expose us to dangers we couldn't even identify, let alone defend against. We loaded our gear into the truck with record speed, our movements sharp and efficient despite the adrenaline coursing through our systems. Dad performed a quick mechanical check: oil, coolant, tire pressure, fuel level, while I secured our equipment in the truck bed. Everything had to be perfect. Breaking down on the remote roads leading out of the canyon would leave us stranded and vulnerable. As Dad started the engine, I took one last look at our campsite. In daylight, it looked innocent enough, just another clearing in an endless forest, marked only by an old fire pit and some trampled vegetation. But I knew I'd never forget the feeling of menace that had grown around this place. The sense that we'd been tolerated as temporary visitors in territory belonging to something else entirely. The truck roared to life, its diesel engine sounding unnaturally loud in the mountain stillness. As we pulled away from the clearing, I found myself hoping that our departure would end whatever interest our mysterious watchers had taken in us. But deep down, I suspected that leaving Devil's Canyon would not be as simple as driving away. The forest seemed to press in around us as we navigated the narrow dirt road, branches scraping against the truck's windows like grasping fingers. And somewhere in the rearview mirror, I could swear I saw movement among the trees, dark shapes that might have been shadows, or might have been something else entirely, following our departure with interest that felt anything but benign. The dirt road out of Devil's Canyon proved more treacherous than our inbound journey, partly due to our haste, and partly because something fundamental had changed about the landscape itself. Features I remembered from the drive-in, distinctive rock formations, fallen trees, even the shape of certain curves, seemed different now, as if the forest had rearranged itself while we slept. Dad noticed it too, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as we navigated turns that should have been familiar but felt foreign. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, slowing the truck to a crawl as we approached what should have been a straightforward section of road. What we found instead was a deliberate obstruction. Someone had dragged fallen trees across the track, creating a barrier that would force any vehicle to stop. The logs were massive, ancient pines that would have required heavy equipment or multiple people to move. Yet they'd been positioned with precision, creating narrow gaps that allowed foot traffic but made vehicular passage impossible. "Roadblock," Dad said grimly, putting the truck in park. "Planned and deliberate." We sat in the idling truck for several minutes, studying the obstruction and the forest around it. The trees created perfect cover for an ambush, their thick trunks and low-hanging branches providing countless hiding spots for anyone who might be watching our approach. Yet we saw no movement, heard no sounds beyond the natural whisper of wind through pine needles. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad checked his sidearm, then reached behind the seat for his rifle. "We clear the road, fast and careful. You watch the tree line while I move the logs." But as we climbed out of the truck, we discovered that clearing the road wouldn't be as simple as we'd hoped. The logs weren't just blocking our path, they'd been deliberately secured in place with heavy-gauge wire, twisted tight around anchor points driven deep into the ground. Someone had invested significant time and effort in making this barrier as permanent as possible. More disturbing, we found evidence that we weren't the first travelers to encounter this obstruction. Hidden among the trees beside the road were the rusted remains of an older vehicle, a pickup truck that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its tires were flat, its windows spider-webbed with cracks, and vegetation was beginning to reclaim its body. But most unsettling was the driver's door, which hung open as if the occupant had left in great haste. "Jesus," I breathed, approaching the abandoned truck. "How long has this been here?" Dad joined me, his expression grim as he examined the vehicle. The license plate was too corroded to read, but the truck's design suggested it was at least 20 years old. Inside, we found personal effects scattered across the seats: a thermos, some maps, a hunting license from 1998 made out to someone named Vernon Kowalski. "Dad," I said, pointing to something that made my skin crawl. "Look at the windshield." The glass was covered in scratches, Not random damage from years of weathering, but deliberate marks that formed the same disturbing symbol we'd seen carved into the tree at the overlook. The scratches had been made from inside the vehicle, as if the driver had clawed at the glass in desperation, trying to mark something important before what? We found our answer in the truck bed, hidden under a tarp that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. Scattered across the metal surface were dozens of bones, human bones, sorted and arranged with the same methodical precision we'd seen in the shrine near our campsite. Among them, we found a wallet containing Vernon Kowalski's identification, a photo of a smiling family, and a note written in increasingly erratic handwriting. Dad read the note aloud, his voice barely steady. "They're everywhere, watching, following, can't leave, roadblocked. God help me, they're not human. If someone finds this, don't come looking. Run. Get out while you still can." The message was dated September 15th, 1998, over 20 years ago. Vernon Kowalski had encountered the same mysterious presence we'd discovered, but unlike us, he'd never made it out of Devil's Canyon. The implications were terrifying. How many other hunters, campers, hikers had disappeared in this remote area over the years? How many vehicles lay hidden in the forest, their occupants reduced to carefully arranged bone collections? "We're walking out," Dad said quietly, folding the note and putting it in his pocket. "Right now." I wanted to argue, to suggest we could find another route or somehow clear the roadblock, but the evidence before us made such hopes seem naive. Whatever controlled this territory had been operating for decades, perfecting methods for trapping and disposing of intruders. Our truck would only slow us down, make us easier targets. We grabbed essential gear from the vehicle, water, first aid kit, map and compass, ammunition, and began the long hike out of the canyon. The main road was 12 miles away, all of it through increasingly difficult terrain. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a challenging but manageable day hike. But these were far from normal circumstances. As we set off on foot, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The forest around us was completely silent. No birds sang in the trees, no squirrels chattered warnings, no insects buzzed in the underbrush. It was as if every living creature had fled the area, leaving only an oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle even our own footsteps. We'd been walking for about an hour when we encountered the first antler. It was mounted on a broken tree branch at head height, positioned directly beside the trail where it couldn't be missed. The antler was massive, from a bull elk that must have been enormous in life, but it had been modified somehow, sharpened into points, and carved with the same disturbing symbols we'd seen elsewhere. "Warning marker," Dad said grimly. "Territory boundary." But as we continued along the trail, we found more antlers. They appeared at regular intervals, each one larger and more elaborately modified than the last. Some had been bleached white, others painted with what looked like dried blood. All of them bore carved symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when viewed directly, making my eyes water and my head pound. The antlers were clearly meant to intimidate, to mark territory, and warn away intruders. But they also served another purpose. They were leading us somewhere. The trail of antlers curved away from the direct route out of the canyon, guiding travelers toward some unknown destination deeper in the wilderness. "We're not following their breadcrumbs," Dad said firmly. "We stick to the game trail, head straight for the main road." But as we tried to maintain our chosen route, we discovered that the forest itself had become our enemy. Trails we'd followed on the way in had vanished, replaced by impenetrable thickets of thorny undergrowth. Streams we'd crossed easily now ran too deep and fast to ford safely. Even the topography seemed different, with ridges and valleys that didn't match Dad's carefully annotated maps. It was as if the landscape was actively working against us, forcing us toward the antler trail, whether we wanted to follow it or not. Every alternate route we attempted led to dead ends, cliff faces, or terrain too dangerous to navigate. The antlers beckoned from the one path that remained open, their carved symbols seeming to pulse with malevolent invitation. "They're hurting us," I realized with growing horror, "like cattle to slaughter." Dad nodded grimly, checking his rifle for the dozenth time. "Question is, do we let them drive us where they want to go, or do we make our stand here?" The choice was impossible. Following the antler trail meant walking into whatever trap had been prepared for us, but attempting to bushwhack through the hostile terrain would exhaust our strength and leave us vulnerable to attack when we were weakest. We were being given an illusion of choice while being maneuvered toward a predetermined outcome. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, we made our decision. We would follow the antler trail, but on our terms. Dad took point, rifle ready, while I covered our rear. We moved slowly, carefully, studying every tree, every shadow, every potential ambush site. If we were walking into a trap, we would at least go in prepared to fight. The antlers led us deeper into the canyon, through terrain that grew increasingly surreal and threatening. The trees here were different, older, more gnarled, their branches forming unnatural patterns that hurt to look at directly. The very air seemed thicker, charged with a malevolent energy that made our skin crawl and our hearts race. And always, we felt the sensation of being watched. Not the casual observation of wildlife, but the focused attention of intelligent beings studying our every move, analyzing our strengths and weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The antler trail was leading us somewhere specific, and with each step, I became more certain that we would not like what we found at its end. The antler trail led us through increasingly alien terrain, where the familiar rules of mountain ecology seemed suspended. Trees grew in perfect circles around bare patches of earth, their branches intertwining overhead to form natural cathedrals that blocked out the sky. Flowers bloomed out of season, their colors too bright, too intense, like drops of neon paint scattered across the forest floor. Even the rocks seemed wrong, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence but followed no geometry I could understand. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows between the trees, we reached what could only be described as an amphitheater. The forest opened into a natural bowl carved from the mountainside, its walls lined with towering pines that formed perfect sightlines to a flat area at the center. The space felt ancient, sacred, like a place where significant events had unfolded for centuries. At the center of the clearing stood a structure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was built from bones, thousands of them, arranged in complex geometric patterns that rose nearly 20 feet into the air. Human skulls formed decorative elements at key points, their empty sockets seeming to track our movement as we approached. The entire construction was held together with sinew and wire, creating a monument to death that dwarfed anything we'd encountered so far. "God almighty," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is this place?" The bone structure wasn't random. It had been carefully planned and executed by someone with both architectural knowledge and unlimited access to human remains. The base was a perfect circle, with spokes radiating outward like the points of a compass. Vertical elements rose at calculated intervals, connected by horizontal beams that formed complex patterns when viewed from different angles. But it was the smell that truly revealed the horror of what we'd discovered. The air was thick with the stench of decay, not the clean decomposition of natural death, but something fouler, more deliberate. Hidden among the bones were fresher remains, strips of meat, organs, things that had been carefully preserved and displayed as offerings or warnings. We approached the structure with extreme caution, rifles ready, every instinct screaming at us to turn and run. But fascination overcame fear as we began to understand the true scope of what we were seeing. This wasn't the work of a single disturbed individual. It represented decades of systematic collection, organization, and construction. Someone, or some group, had been killing in these mountains for a very long time. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a section of the bone monument where skulls had been arranged according to size. "They're sorted, organized by age." Dad joined me, his face pale as he studied the grisly display. The smallest skulls were clearly children, arranged in neat rows like a macabre inventory. Adults were separated by gender, with male and female remains forming distinct sections of the structure. The organization was methodical, scientific, suggesting minds that approached murder with the same systematic precision others might apply to building a house. As we circled the bone monument, we discovered that each section was marked with symbols carved into strategically placed femurs and tibias. The same twisted designs we'd seen throughout the canyon, But here they were more elaborate, formed into something approaching a written language. Someone had been keeping records, documenting their work with the pride of craftsmen. "We need to document this," Dad said, pulling out his phone despite knowing we had no signal. "Police are going to need evidence." He began taking photographs, capturing the structure from multiple angles while I stood guard. The click of the camera shutter seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the clearing, and I found myself wincing with each shot, certain the sound would draw unwanted attention. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing, dark shapes that might have been branches swaying in the wind. But as my eyes adjusted to the gathering dusk, I began to make out human figures. Tall, impossibly thin, they moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural, their limbs bending at angles that suggested either extreme flexibility or broken bones. "Dad," I whispered urgently, "we've got company." He looked up from his photography, following my gaze to the tree line. What he saw made him freeze, the camera hanging forgotten in his hands. They were emerging from the forest now, stepping into the fading light of the clearing with the confidence of predators in their own territory. There were 7 of them, arranged in a loose semicircle that would soon surround our position. In the dim light, it was difficult to make out details, but what I could see made my stomach churn. They wore clothing of some kind, but it hung in tatters from frames that seemed stretched beyond normal human proportions. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their movements suggested a familiarity with the bone monument that was deeply disturbing. The tallest figure, clearly the leader, raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at us. When it spoke, its voice carried clearly across the clearing despite the obvious distance. A sound like wind through dry leaves formed into something approaching human speech. "Visitors," it said, the word stretched and distorted until it barely resembled language. "Welcome to our cathedral." Dad raised his rifle, sighting on the leader's center mass. "Stay back," he shouted. "We're armed." The response was laughter, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to come from all directions at once. The figures began to move, closing the circle around us with deliberate patience. They weren't rushing, weren't showing any fear of our weapons. Instead, they moved with the confidence of beings who had performed this ritual many times before. "Weapons are useless here," the leader continued, its voice growing stronger as it approached. "This is sacred ground, consecrated by blood. Your blood will join the foundation." I could see them more clearly now, and what I saw defied rational explanation. They had once been human, that much was clear from their basic anatomy. But something had changed them, stretched them, twisted them into forms that retained human intelligence while abandoning human limitations. Their fingers ended in claws that looked sharp enough to cut steel, and their teeth had been filed into points that gleamed wetly in the dying light. "The canyon chooses who may leave," another voice called from the shadows. "The canyon has not chosen you." They were close enough now that I could smell them, a mixture of decay and something else, something chemical that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. It was the smell of preservation, of bodies that had been treated with substances that prevented normal decomposition while allowing consciousness to persist. Dad fired a warning shot into the air, the rifle's report echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. For a moment, the figures paused, but rather than retreating, they seemed amused by the display. "Noise," the leader observed. "How delightfully primitive." That's when I realized the true horror of our situation. These weren't wild animals or deranged humans operating on instinct. They were intelligent, organized, and completely confident in their ability to handle any resistance we might offer. They had been doing this for decades, perfecting their methods, learning from each encounter. We weren't their first armed visitors, and we certainly wouldn't be their last. "Run," Dad said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching figures. "On 3. Head for the trees on the north side. I'll cover you." "I'm not leaving you," I replied, though my voice shook with terror. "You'll do as I say," he said firmly. "Someone needs to get out, needs to tell people what's happening here, that's you." The figures were less than 50 yards away now, moving with that same fluid grace that defied normal human locomotion. In the gathering darkness, their pale skin seemed to glow with phosphorescent light, and their eyes reflected what little starlight penetrated the forest canopy. 1. Dad counted quietly. I gripped my rifle tighter, knowing that running would likely mean abandoning him to a fate too horrible to contemplate. But staying would mean both of us becoming additions to their bone cathedral, our remains carefully sorted and incorporated into their grotesque monument. 2. The leader raised its hand again, and the other figures stopped their advance. For a moment, the clearing was frozen in tableau, predators and prey facing each other across ground consecrated by decades of murder. 3. The moment Dad shouted 3, everything erupted into chaos. I broke left toward the tree line while Dad opened fire on the approaching figures, his rifle cracking repeatedly in the confined space of the amphitheater. The muzzle flashes lit up the clearing in stark, strobing light, revealing glimpses of our pursuers that my mind struggled to process. They moved unlike anything human, flowing between the gunshots with liquid grace, their elongated limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Dad's shots were finding targets. I could see the impact of bullets striking flesh, but the figures absorbed the damage without slowing, dark fluid streaming from wounds that should have been fatal. "Go, go, go," Dad shouted, working the bolt of his rifle to chamber fresh rounds. I reached the tree line just as the first of our pursuers closed with Dad. Even from 30 yards away, I could hear the sound of claws on metal as it tried to tear the rifle from his hands. He rolled away, drawing his sidearm and firing point-blank into the creature's torso. The .45 caliber bullets punched through its body with wet tearing sounds, but still, it kept coming. Part of me wanted to turn back, to help him fight, but Dad's final order had been clear. Someone had to escape, had to carry word of what was happening in Devil's Canyon to the outside world. If I died here, all evidence of this place would die with us. I plunged into the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I ran through undergrowth that seemed designed to slow and entangle. Behind me, the sounds of combat continued, gunshots, inhuman screams, and Dad's voice shouting challenges that grew increasingly desperate. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and obstacles, every root and branch a potential trap for running feet. I had no flashlight, relying instead on what little starlight filtered through the canopy to navigate the treacherous terrain. My rifle slowed me down, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon it. It might be the only thing standing between me and the same fate that had befallen Vernon Kowalski. I'd been running for maybe 10 minutes when I realized the gunfire had stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of battle because it suggested that Dad's resistance had been overcome. The thought hit me like a physical blow, sending me stumbling against a tree trunk where I fought down the urge to vomit. They would be coming for me now. Whatever those things were, they wouldn't be content with a single victim. The Bone Cathedral suggested they were collectors, gatherers who took pride in completing their sets. As long as I remained free, their work would be unfinished. I forced myself to start moving again, trying to remember Dad's lessons about wilderness navigation. Without compass or map, my only reliable guide was the slope of the terrain. Water flowed downhill, and following water would eventually lead to larger streams, then rivers, then roads. But in the darkness, even identifying slope was difficult, and I found myself repeatedly climbing when I should have been descending. The forest around me felt alive with malevolent intelligence. Every shadow could hide a pursuer, every sound might herald an attack. I tried to move quietly, but panic made stealth impossible. Branches cracked under my feet, leaves rustled with my passage, and my own breathing seemed loud enough to attract attention from miles away. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard them behind me. Not the crashing passage of human pursuers, but something far more terrifying. The soft whisper of movement through undergrowth, barely audible but getting steadily closer. They were tracking me, following my trail with the patience of experienced hunters who knew their prey couldn't escape. I tried to increase my pace, but the terrain was becoming more difficult. The slope was steepening, broken by ravines and rocky outcroppings that forced me to detour repeatedly. Each change of direction might be taking me further from safety, deeper into the wilderness that was their domain. A sound ahead made me freeze, the distinctive crack of a breaking branch. I dropped to a crouch behind a fallen log, rifle ready, trying to control my breathing as I strained to identify the source of the noise. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then I saw it. One of the pale figures was standing less than 20 feet away, perfectly motionless between two large pine trees. In the darkness, it was barely visible, but its unnatural stillness marked it as clearly foreign to the forest environment. It was waiting, watching, testing my nerves. I remained frozen behind the log, knowing that any movement would trigger an attack. My rifle was loaded and ready, but Dad's experience had shown that conventional weapons were of limited effectiveness against these creatures. Still, it was the only advantage I possessed. Minutes passed in tense silence. My legs began to cramp from the awkward position, and I knew I couldn't maintain this standoff indefinitely. Worse, where there was one pursuer, there were likely others. I might be sitting in the center of a trap, surrounded by creatures waiting for me to reveal my position. The decision was made for me when I heard movement to my left. Another figure approaching through the undergrowth. In seconds, I would be caught between them, with no room to maneuver and nowhere to run. I had to act. I rose from behind the log and fired at the nearest figure, working the bolt rapidly to chamber a fresh round. The bullet struck center mass, spinning the creature around but not dropping it. It released a scream that sounded like tearing metal, then launched itself toward my position with inhuman speed. I fired again, this shot taking it in the head and finally dropping it to the forest floor. But the sound of gunfire had given away my position to every predator in the area, and I could hear them converging on my location from multiple directions. I ran. The next hour became a nightmare of flight through hostile terrain, pursued by enemies who seemed to know the forest better than any human could. They herded me like wolves hunting deer, appearing at strategic points to cut off escape routes, forcing me to move in directions they chose. I was being driven somewhere specific, toward some predetermined destination. My ammunition was running low. Only a handful of rounds remained in my rifle, with perhaps a dozen more in my jacket pockets. At the rate I was encountering pursuers, I would be defenseless within minutes. But still, I ran, driven by the desperate hope that I might reach help before my resources were exhausted. The forest began to thin as I climbed higher into the mountains, the dense pine stands giving way to rocky terrain dotted with stunted trees. The change in environment offered both advantages and disadvantages. Better visibility but less cover, easier movement but nowhere to hide. It was in this rocky landscape that I made my final stand. I reached the edge of a cliff just as dawn began to break over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gray that barely illuminated the nightmare landscape below. Behind me, the rocky face dropped away into darkness, a fall that would certainly be fatal. Ahead, the pale figures emerged from the tree line with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. There were 5 of them now, moving with that same fluid grace that defied human anatomy. In the growing light, I could see them more clearly than ever before, and the sight made my hands shake as I raised my rifle. They had once been human. That much was undeniable, but something had transformed them into creatures that retained intelligence while abandoning humanity. Their skin was translucent, revealing the dark network of veins beneath. Their limbs were elongated beyond normal proportions, joints bending at angles that should have been impossible. Most disturbing were their faces, which retained enough human features to be recognizable while being utterly alien in expression. Their eyes were completely black, reflecting light like polished obsidian, and their mouths were filled with teeth that had been filed into sharp points. "End of the trail," the leader said, its voice carrying clearly across the rocky ground. "Nowhere left to run." I backed against the cliff face, rifle trained on the nearest figure. "What do you want?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "What we have always wanted," it replied. "What the canyon demands. Blood for the foundation, bone for the cathedral." They began to spread out, moving to flank my position. I had perhaps 3 rounds left in my rifle, with maybe 8 more in my pocket. Against 5 opponents who had demonstrated resistance to conventional weapons, the mathematics were hopeless. "Your father fought well," another voice added with what might have been admiration. "His strength was impressive. His bones will hold a place of honor in our construction." The mention of Dad sent rage coursing through my system, temporarily overwhelming the fear that had been driving me through the night. These things had killed him, had added his remains to their grotesque monument, and they were speaking of it like some kind of honor. "You murdered him," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "We transformed him," the leader corrected, "as we will transform you. Death is only the beginning of service to the canyon." They were close enough now that I could smell them, that mixture of decay and chemical preservation that had marked them from our first encounter. Up close, their unnatural nature was even more apparent. These weren't living beings in any sense I understood, but something that existed in the space between life and death. I fired my first shot at the leader, the bullet striking it in the chest and staggering it backward. Dark fluid sprayed from the wound, but within seconds the creature was advancing again, the hole in its torso already beginning to close. "Futile," it observed. "We are beyond such simple harm." My second shot took another figure in the head, dropping it to the rocky ground, but even as it fell, I could see movement in the wound, tissue beginning to knit itself back together with unnatural speed. The third shot went wide as the remaining figures rushed my position simultaneously. I had time to chamber one more round before the first creature reached me, its clawed hands grasping for my throat. I fired point-blank into its face, the muzzle flash searing my own eyes. The impact destroyed most of its head, sending it tumbling backward, but the others kept coming. I swung the rifle like a club, the steel stock connecting with bone and flesh that felt wrong under the impact. Claws raked across my jacket, tearing through the heavy fabric and scoring the skin beneath. I rolled away from the cliff edge, using the rifle's length to keep some distance between myself and my attackers. But they were faster, stronger, and completely without fear. One of them grabbed the rifle barrel, its superhuman strength threatening to tear the weapon from my hands. I held on desperately, using the creature's grip to pull myself closer before driving my knee into what I hoped was a vulnerable area. The impact sent it staggering, but others were closing in from different angles. That's when I heard the helicopter. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the sounds of combat, but it grew steadily stronger. Someone was coming. Rescue, or at least witnesses to what was happening in Devil's Canyon. The pale figures heard it too, their black eyes turning skyward with what might have been concern. "Impossible," the leader hissed, its voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "No one comes to the canyon. No one finds this place unless we allow it." But the helicopter was definitely real, its rotor noise echoing off the canyon walls as it approached our position. I used the distraction to break free from my attackers, scrambling across the rocky ground toward a position where I might be visible from the air. The pale figures seemed uncertain for the first time since our encounter began. They moved with less coordination, their attention divided between me and the approaching aircraft. Whatever power they wielded in Devil's Canyon, it apparently didn't extend to controlling the outside world's intrusion into their territory. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the emergency whistle Dad had insisted I carry, a device designed to signal rescue aircraft. The shrill blast cut through the morning air, hopefully loud enough to guide the helicopter to our exact location. The response was immediate. The helicopter changed course, swinging toward the cliff where I stood. Below its cockpit, I could see the distinctive markings of the Colorado State Patrol, and hanging from its side was rescue equipment that suggested this wasn't a routine flight. The pale figures were retreating now, moving back toward the tree line with obvious reluctance. Whatever they were, whatever power had sustained them in the depths of the canyon, they apparently couldn't operate openly in the presence of official witnesses. "This isn't over," the leader called as it reached the edge of the forest. "The canyon remembers. The canyon always remembers." Then they were gone, vanishing into the forest with the same fluid grace that had marked their approach. Within seconds, it was as if they had never existed, leaving me alone on the rocky ground with my torn clothes and empty rifle as the only evidence of what had transpired. The helicopter circled twice before finding a place to land on a relatively flat section of the cliff. 2 state troopers emerged, followed by a medic who immediately began checking me for injuries. Their questions came in rapid succession. Who was I? How had I gotten here? Where were the other members of my party? I tried to explain, but even as I spoke, I could hear how insane my story sounded. Pale creatures that absorbed bullet wounds, bone cathedrals built from decades of murders. My father killed defending our escape. It was the stuff of nightmares, not police reports. Son, one of the troopers said gently, you've been through something traumatic. Sometimes the mind creates explanations for things we can't understand. But they took me seriously enough to organize a search, calling in additional aircraft and ground teams to scour Devil's Canyon for evidence of what I'd described. What they found was enough to launch one of the largest criminal investigations in Colorado history. The search teams found our abandoned truck first, still parked beside the roadblock that had forced us to continue on foot. The barrier itself was exactly as I'd described. Massive logs secured with heavy wire, positioned to trap vehicles while allowing foot traffic to pass. But it was what they discovered in the surrounding forest that transformed my account from the ravings of a traumatized teenager into the foundation of a federal investigation. Vernon Kowalski's truck, with its cargo of carefully arranged bones, provided the first concrete evidence that something terrible had been happening in Devil's Canyon for decades. The forensic team that examined the remains confirmed that they were human, representing at least 15 different individuals of various ages. More disturbing, several of the bones showed signs of deliberate modification, carving, sharpening, and treatment with preservatives that prevented normal decomposition. The search for Dad's body led them to the bone cathedral I'd described, though what they found was far worse than even my traumatized account had suggested. The structure was massive, constructed from the remains of dozens of victims accumulated over what the forensic anthropologists estimated to be at least 30 years. Hidden chambers within the construction contained preserved organs, clothing, and personal effects that told the stories of people who had vanished without a trace. But of Dad himself, they found no sign. His rifle was discovered near the cathedral, along with spent brass casings and blood evidence that confirmed a firefight had taken place. Yet his body was nowhere to be found, leading investigators to conclude that he had either been taken alive or his remains had been removed for purposes they didn't want to contemplate. The pale figures I'd described were never found, despite extensive searches using thermal imaging, tracking dogs, and ground-penetrating radar. The forest showed signs of recent habitation, cave systems that had been modified for human occupation, underground chambers stocked with preserved food and primitive tools. But whoever had been living in Devil's Canyon had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The official investigation lasted 8 months, involving multiple federal agencies and forensic experts from around the country. What they uncovered painted a picture of systematic predation stretching back generations, a cult or clan of individuals who had claimed Devil's Canyon as their territory and eliminated anyone who intruded upon it. DNA evidence recovered from the Bone Cathedral identified victims from across the western United States, people who had disappeared while camping, hunting, or hiking in remote areas. Missing persons cases dating back to the 1970s were suddenly connected to the horrors found in that isolated canyon, providing closure for families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their loved ones. But many questions remained unanswered. Who were the perpetrators? How had they evaded detection for so long? Most importantly, where had they gone, and would they strike again elsewhere? I spent 3 weeks in a Denver hospital, recovering from exposure, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of what I'd witnessed. The doctors were amazed that I'd survived at all, given the conditions I'd endured and the distance I'd covered on foot. But they had no explanation for some of the evidence I'd brought out with me, scratches on my jacket that showed no sign of tearing, as if the fabric had been cut with blades sharper than any known tool. The media attention was overwhelming. My story became national news, spawning documentaries, books, and countless internet theories about what had really happened in Devil's Canyon. most focused on the human perpetrators, treating the case as an extreme example of cult behavior in isolated areas. Few gave credence to my descriptions of the pale figures and their unnatural abilities. I didn't blame them. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. Mom and I moved away from Colorado 6 months later, unable to live in the shadow of the mountains that had taken Dad from us. We settled in suburban Kansas, about as far from wilderness as we could get while remaining in the continental United States. I finished high school there, went to college, got a job in information technology that kept me firmly in the world of concrete and steel. But I never forgot what I'd seen in Devil's Canyon, and I never stopped watching the news for signs that they might have returned. Over the years, there have been occasional reports that caught my attention: hikers disappearing in remote areas, campsites found abandoned with no explanation, bone arrangements discovered in places where they didn't belong. Each time I contacted the investigating authorities, sharing what I knew about the methods and patterns I'd observed. Most dismissed me as a crank, someone whose traumatic experience had left him seeing connections where none existed. A few took me seriously enough to follow up, but none ever found evidence as conclusive as what had been discovered in Devil's Canyon. The area itself was closed to public access indefinitely, declared a crime scene, and then later a research site for federal agencies studying cult behavior and organized predation. Guard posts were established at all known access points, and regular patrols were instituted to ensure that no one could return to continue the work that had been interrupted. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever those pale figures were, whatever power had sustained them for decades in that remote canyon, it couldn't be contained by government barriers and warning signs. They were patient, intelligent, and completely committed to their cause. They would wait, adapt, and eventually find another place to continue their work. 3 years have passed since that October morning when Dad and I drove into Devil's Canyon, expecting nothing more than a successful hunting trip. I'm 20 now, working in a climate-controlled office building surrounded by millions of people, about as far from the wilderness as a person can get. But every night when I close my eyes, I'm back on that cliff face, watching pale figures emerge from the forest with predatory grace. The story I'm about to tell you only a few people close to me have ever heard. However, I never actually explained in detail what happened that night to absolutely anyone. I live next to Yellowstone National Park, which itself draws millions of tourists each year. Part of the reason I'm writing this is merely a warning to people who decide to visit during the summer months. Last year in the summer of 2020, some buddies and I decided to go have a night out and do some camping out near a spot we've been to multiple times in the past. After all, this was right after things started to go back to normal again, concerning the Rona. I decided to head up to the camp spot early, in an effort to make sure my gear was still set up from earlier that day. I wanted to make sure my spot was reserved, as it's first come, first serve. Therefore, with everything in hand, I left my house right before sunset. We were all supposed to meet up within the hour, so I didn't really have any concerns of being alone. I began my 30-minute drive up to the location. When I finally made it there, I immediately noticed my tent and everything inside was gone. Now I'd staked the tent down in multiple areas, just be sure it stayed for the period I was gone. Inside was my sleeping bag and a few other miscellaneous items, which I left just to keep it weighed down. However, everything, and I mean literally everything, had disappeared as if it had never been there. I looked around and even the stakes and rocks I placed on the outside were missing. Right away I knew something was wrong because I didn't see any campers on the way up either. Keep in mind I do not have cell service out here as it's a couple miles back into the wilderness. I decided to drive back down from where I came from to get some service. I needed to get a hold of my friends to let them know what happened. I wasn't happy with the situation at all, and I knew that whoever took my stuff was probably still in the area. It had only been there for an hour or two. However, when I got a hold of my friends, they insisted that I stayed and at least hung out for a few hours, as it had taken us weeks of planning. Once I made sure everyone arrived, I then decided to go around the area, searching for any signs of footprints or indicators that maybe these people were close by, the ones that messed with my stuff. As you can guess, I wasn't able to find anything. Eventually, I played it off, deciding I would just look for it in the morning. I could contact the Forest Service to report it missing too. I also didn't want to ruin the party for everyone and decided to stay. In hindsight, this was by far one of the worst decisions I could have ever made. As the night went on, everything seemed fine. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, most of my friends decided to call it a night. I ended up sleeping in my truck. This was perhaps one of the better decisions I made that night, that along with always making sure to bring my bear spray and sidearm for protection from unexpected guests. Eventually, I fell asleep. However, it's important to note that I was still a bit on edge, aggravated by my things being stolen and suspicious of whoever may have done it. I decided to leave my window rolled down a bit, just in case I heard anything creep up on us in the middle of the night. After about 2 hours of sleep, my worst nightmare came true. At first, I heard something moving around outside the campsite. This was enough noise to wake me up, and right away I froze, not moving whatsoever. My lack of movement was partly due to the fact that whatever was making the noise seemed to be huge, not just a raccoon or a smaller creature. I sat there, paralyzed, listening intently to whatever was happening outside of our camp. My next thought was that it was a bear. We'd had sightings of bears recently in the area. At one point, I swear it could have only been 20 to 30 yards away from me. Another key point I noticed was that there was absolutely no other sounds. Usually there are grasshoppers or birds, but it was complete and utter silence. In the wild, that's never a good sign. Usually it means there's a larger predator or something of the like in the area. Meanwhile, it's pitch black out, and our fire had completely gone out by then. After about 15 minutes of not hearing anything, I figured I just needed to stop being paranoid. But just as I was about to fall back to sleep, I saw something to the right of our campsite. It was just a few yards away from the fire pit, and probably about 20 yards from me. To my absolute horror, it was a person. I immediately freaked out. This was no average person either, let alone the fact that it's 3 or 4 in the morning, and you're in someone else's campsite. This person was wearing what I made out to be some kind of mask. I got a very good look at whoever it was. The mask on their face was of a deer skull. They also wore a black robe. Seeing this, I sure didn't want to leave my truck to confront this person, so I did what else I thought was best. I turned my truck on and began honking the horn until all my friends were awake. I rolled down the window and told them we need to get out of here immediately. After seeing what I saw, they did exactly that. Meanwhile, this suspicious figure hasn't moved. Just as I thought it was bad, the situation got even worse. More of these figures began appearing in front of us through the trees. They wore the same outfits as mentioned earlier, but with a multitude of different masks. I put my truck into reverse and began speeding away once everyone was inside. As we pulled away, those figures began to walk closer and closer. Luckily, I was able to drive out of there just in time. As I began to speed down the road, 3 more of the figures appeared out from the side of the truck. This time they had a dog, and a lot of them were acting way more aggressive than the previous ones. They began throwing rocks at the truck, chasing after us. At one point, they were literally right next to my passenger window until I accelerated even more and eventually lost them. As I looked back in my mirror, I saw only one figure left, just simply peeking and staring at me from behind a tree. That image is forever seared into my mind. From that night on, I refused to ever go back up there. I've never ever spoke of this to anyone. Even when I was around my friends that experienced this, we never brought it up around each other. It's been over a year now since this happened, and well, all I can say is that these people seem to be in some sort of cult. I've heard other stories about similar events happening and even cattle completely disappearing. It's very barbaric, and you wouldn't think that such a beautiful national park that attracts so many people year-round would have such a dark and disturbing secret. My advice to anyone that decides to travel to these mysterious and preserved parks of intrinsic beauty would be to always bring protection of some kind. Likewise, make sure you let others know about your plans and never go alone, if you can avoid it. There are hundreds of missing person rep across the national parks inside the U.S., and I could have very well become one of them if I had ended up staying a few minutes too long. Nature has a way to attract very different types of people. Some want to explore and push themselves to their limits. Meanwhile, some simply don't want to be seen, and they lurk in the darkness of the night. A former Green Beret once told me the key to survival was always being aware of your surroundings, listening to your instincts. If a particular situation doesn't feel right, chances are there really is something wrong. Stay safe, everyone.